All right, hey, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Again, good morning. My name is Jim Schwartz. I'm the agronomy education lead for 360 Yield Center. So as we go through the presentation this morning, this one should take about 35 minutes. And with that, let's go ahead and get started. Let's start talking about how and when to use stabilizers. As I think about nitrogen stabilizers, yes, today the focus is going to be, which one should I use? What time should I use them? Where should I use them? And I guess the thing I want you to understand is, you can, in hindsight, your decisions are always going to be right. When you make decisions about utilizing stabilizers, you go with the best decision you have, and sometimes you'll see responses, sometimes you won't, but you just have to make the best decisions at the time. So you all see me, I've done a lot of presentations over time, and I've shown this chart about heavy rainfall trends and heavy precipitation in the U.S. I put this up there because as we think about nitrogen, right, and we think about increasing yields, one of the things we have to understand is, as we have more and more of these heavy rainfall events, we have to make sure we're doing everything we can to manage the nitrogen that's available in our soil profile throughout the growing season. And when we have heavy rainfall events, that obviously leads to different loss mechanisms, whether it's leaching or denitrification or surface displacement of nitrogen. So as the weather trends have changed, we have to start paying more and more attention to how we maintain our levels of nitrate at a consistent level throughout the growing season. But the weather's not the only thing that's changing. We can also see that hybrids are changing throughout time. If you look at this chart, again, this is something I've shown over many times in many presentations. Two different university studies comparing old germplasm to new germplasm, and you can see that new germplasm, all right, is using more nitrogen later in the year. Excuse me for a second. And therefore, we need to make sure, again, we have more rainfall, and we need to supply more nitrogen later in the year. We've got to make sure we're doing everything we can to maintain that nitrogen supply throughout the growing season. The other thing to think about, again, this is another graph I've shown many times, is that over time there's been a lot of research done that talks about, this is by Dr. Jerry Hatfield, who shows that the longer we can keep plants alive and green, the higher the yields. Those are direct correlations. That's 3 different years of data. And basically what he's showing is the longer we keep plants healthy and green, all right, the more yield we're going to have. And nitrogen is one of the key components in maintaining plant health. So we've got to make sure that we're keeping that nitrogen available all throughout the season to keep those plants alive, to feed them as they need more nitrogen later in the presence of more and more heavy rainfall events. In order to understand what stabilizer I should use, I think the starting point is to understand how do we lose it, right? There really are 4 main mechanisms. A lot of people talk about 3, but it's important. There are 4 ways nitrogen is lost, in my opinion. Volatilization, which really we're dealing with the urea molecule in that case. Denitrification, which is basically it's conversion of nitrate to gas. All right, that's denitrification. That's in heavier, more poorly drained soils. Leaching, or the movement via a waterfront of the nitrate molecule down through your soil profile. All right, either out of reach of your roots or into the tile lines. And then surface displacement is one we don't actually talk about, but as we've moved more to urea and urea prills, it's important to understand that, and as we have sloping and fields with undulations, if you apply a prill, right, a urea prill, and you get a 3-inch rainfall, I'm pretty sure that you're going to see, and you could see pools of those urea prills displaced in an ununiform fashion in the field. And it's important to think about as we're talking about nitrogen loss and movement. Okay, so those are the ways it's lost. Let's go on. So if those are the ways we lose it, how do we prevent it? Okay, there are 2 common ways, and I'm gonna go through it a little bit, and there's some newer ways as well, but there's 2 really common ways that we can stop the loss, those 4 ways of losing it that I mentioned above. One is to stop or slow nitrification, and one is to stop or slow hydrolysis. Those are the 2 main methods that we think about when we think about using a nitrification or a urease inhibitor to stop nitrogen loss, okay? Now there are polymer coatings, there's polymers and biologicals, and there's also sulfur coating, and I'll talk about those as well as they relate to reducing nitrogen loss, okay? So when I talk about slowing or stopping nitrification, slowing or stopping hydrolysis or volatilization, what is that, okay? Let's talk about that briefly before we dig into the different stabilizers themselves and when to use them, okay? So this is the nitrification process. In my first webinar, and those of you who've seen my presentations before, you know, I always say nitrification is good and bad, right? Because that molecule over on the right-hand side, the nitrate molecule, NO3 negative, that's the molecule that the corn plant takes up the vast majority of its nitrogen in that form. So we want to get it there in the nitrate form over time. But the problem is bad things also happen to that nitrate molecule right there. It's leachable. Your soil is negatively charged. The nitrate molecule is negatively charged, all right? So we can leach, and the nitrate molecule also will denitrify. That's another process, all right? And it will be converted to a gas, nitrous oxide, dinitrous oxide, pure nitrogen gas. Now, if you see this process in the middle, I've got an arrow. One of the drivers of this process is a bacteria called nitrosomonas, okay? So when I said there are ways that we lose nitrogen, I said we can leach it, we can denitrify it, right? That's dealing with the nitrate molecule right up there on the right. So one of the ways we can slow or control this process is to slow down or reduce the bacteria, the nitrosomonas bacteria, and slow this process down and keep the nitrogen in that ammonium form, NH4+, because ammonium is positively charged or so negatively charged. It's held there. So if we can slow this process down, all right, we can keep that nitrogen held in the soil and slow and control the conversion to nitrate, and thus reduce our exposure, right, of the nitrate molecule to either leaching or denitrification. So that is, when I say a nitrification inhibitor, this is what we're talking about. We're talking about slowing this process down. Now, I'm not talking about, this is not the urea molecule here. So this, we don't worry about volatilization in this process. And so there's one kind of nitrification inhibitor we would use, or one kind of a stabilizer we would use here, and that's a nitrification inhibitor, okay? Let's go on. So the nitrification inhibitors, all right, and by the way, one thing I want to say, this is not intended to be an exhaustive list. I'm sure I'm missing products. As these products become more generic, there's other offshoots. So I apologize. I'm not attempting to be all-inclusive of my list. I'm using some of the more common products. But what the nitrification inhibitors do, they target those bacteria to slow that conversion. You can use it for anhydrous. You can use it for liquid urea, manure, things like that. All right. I should say urea, ammonium nitrate. But they kill that bacteria and slow the conversion of ammonium to nitrite and then to nitrate. Most of the nitrification inhibitors out there that we're going to talk about, things like Inserv, Instinct, which is the active ingredient is nitropyrin. There's Guardian or other DCD products, dicyanidamide, diamide. Those products slow or kill that bacteria. And by the way, nitropyrin is fairly targeted for nitrosomonas, okay? So it really is fairly targeted for the nitrosomonas bacteria. But again, what nitrification inhibitors do is slow the conversion of the ammonium molecule to nitrite and then nitrate. That's what they do. And they do a very good job. They're very effective in what they do. And they give us another, I'll back up, that process, that scientific equation that I showed you before, it's biological, so depending on temperature, moisture, pH, oxygen, things like that, that can take 3 to 5 weeks. But when we kill those bacteria, basically it takes a while for those bacteria to repopulate, all right? And so depending on how quickly they repopulate, again, temperature, moisture, pH, things like that, you can keep your ammonium in the nitrogen form another 3 or 4 weeks. And again, it depends on, because those bacteria have to repopulate, depends on the conditions in your soil, how quickly they will do that. but you can delay that process and keep that nitrogen in the ammonium form longer than just 3 or 4 weeks. Okay, but that's nitrification inhibitors. We're trying to stop the process of nitrification. Okay, so when I said there were 4 ways we lose it, right? Denitrification and leaching, that's the nitrate molecule. I also said hydrolysis, we call this volatilization. That is dealing with the urea molecule. That's the CONH2 on the left. That's urea. Now, when we spread urea on our soils, right, we talked about this in the other webinar, it combines with water, and then an enzyme called urease will move that molecule over to ammonia, right? And then that ammonia will combine with hydrogen in the soil and create ammonium, right? And then it's held by the soil. But in the interim step, ammonia is a gas. So what we want to happen is we want to get that molecule, that CONH2, we want to get it in contact with soil so that when it grabs that hydrogen molecule, it becomes ammonium, it's held by the soil, and we don't lose it, it doesn't gas off. So we can do that, like, for instance, let's say we throw that molecule on the surface of the soil, it's a bare soil, and the very next day we get 3/10 of an inch of rain. We've accomplished the task, we don't have to worry about it. It's washed into the soil and we're good. But if that molecule lays on the surface of the soil, and by the way, I'm not talking just about urea prills, right? Excuse me, 28% is urea ammonium nitrate. 50% of the 28% is in the urea molecule, that molecule on the left. So we want to give us more time to wash that urea molecule into the soil so that when it combines with hydrogen and creates ammonium, we don't gas it off, okay? So to stop the gassing off, what we do, we target that enzyme called urease, all right? And in essence, what it does, it gives us another window of 10 days, maybe 2 weeks before this process occurs, and it gives us another window to get more rainfall to wash it into contact with the soil, so this process goes off and we don't lose it. So that's a urease inhibitor, stopping volatilization. But this is only really, we're only concerned about this urea molecule. So, and again, this is a biological process, so warmer the temperature, the faster this will go. If you have heavy residue and the urea doesn't get in contact with the soil, you'll lose more. If you're in a no-till and you spread lime on top and you have higher pH at the surface, you will drive this faster. If you spread urea a day after a rainfall, this will go faster. If you, by the way, this is why in the old days you could spread urea on snow, right? And as the snow melted in, it carried it in the soil because it was so cold, it didn't drive this process very quickly. But again, what we're trying to accomplish with the urease inhibitor is stop the process of gassing off of the urea molecule. So urease inhibitors, all right, we're targeting that urea molecule at 28%. We can actually target it also in manure. We can target it for surface applied urea, but it is to prevent the volatilization of urea to that ammonia gas before we can get it in contact with soil. There's some common products out there, all right? You've probably all heard of Limus. Limus actually has 2 compounds, NBPT and NPPT. Agritane has NBPT, and they're private label products as well. I will tell you these are very effective products. In other words, what I mean by that is they do what they say, okay? They prevent the urease enzyme from binding, and so it works. They work, they stop the process. I get a lot of questions about sulfur coating and sulfur coating of urea as well. It works, right? I mean, here's how it works. If you remember when I talked about urea hydrolysis, I said higher pHs will drive that process faster. Well, lower pHs will drive it slower. And so sulfur can, as it dissociates, creates a weak acid. So around the urea prill, it will create a lower pH, and therefore it slows that process down. And so guys ask me, hey, if I sulfur coat or if I use ATS, does that perform the role or function of urease inhibition or nitrification inhibition? The answer is that they can and they do because they lower the pH. But in my personal opinion, if I'm comparing like sulfur effectiveness to like a Limus or an Agritane or some of those other NBPT products, I give sulfur a 3 or a 4. I give those products, basically a 10. They do what they say, all right, when you put them on. So those are urease inhibitors. Those are targeting the urea molecule and stopping volatilization. Now, there are some products and newer products, and again, this is not an exhaustive list, who are targeting both urea hydrolysis and nitrification inhibition, all right? So if you think about that, if you have manure or if you have 28%, so 28% is urea ammonium nitrate, all right? If you're putting that on at V3, and you're trying to, we'll talk about that in a minute, you're trying to make sure you're delivering nitrogen all the way out into growing season where we typically have a lot of rainfall, it's entirely reasonable to think about using both products to stop the volatilization and to stop the nitrification, stop or slow the nitrification process in order to keep that nitrogen in the ammonium form. So there are products coming out that will do both, okay? And those products, they work. They do what they say. One thing, I also mentioned there were some newer areas, and I just want to touch on those. One of them is polymer coating, okay? The concept with polymer coating is you coat that urea granule, time and temperature, all right, will wear that coating off over time, and then basically gives you time to get a rainfall, except you've got to have, you have to have that rainfall. But the moisture is more of a big factor than the heat to get that worn off and then wash that granule down in the soil. They work. They do what they say. There's delayed release of the nitrogen. You have to consider that if you're going to use, okay, if you're going to use a polymer coating, you just have to make sure and understand that once you coat it, there's a release. When it's released, it goes into the ammonium form, then ammonium has to be converted to nitrite. So you want to make sure, in my opinion, you want to make sure you have some nitrogen available. You wouldn't want to polymer coat and only use urea as your nitrogen source, because you could end up in a situation where you're starving the corn plant. So they work. The thing I would say, and this is what I talked about, surface displacement. I mean, the polymer coatings work, but when you throw that prill out there, you can wash it off. The other thing that I would say is keep in mind that if you think about a urea prill, it's entirely likely or possible that the coating itself is not uniformly distributed over the urea prill. So you may have a thin spot. If that thin spot would wear out faster, you can see some of that nitrogen kind of leak, kind of like a small hole in a pit in your tire, right? It can leak. It's a slower leak. What you'll also find is, depending on when you're putting on polymer coated urea, some retailers will actually blend treated with untreated. And the reason they do that is what I talked about above, is that you want some nitrogen available immediately and some delayed, and so therefore they will blend treated and untreated when they apply it, and that's why they do it. Okay, there are other forms coming out. There are some copolymers. The literature, you've heard Nutrisphere Orange. So basically, here's their if you read the literature, they're saying that basically it ties up copper, which is critical for the nitrosomonas bacteria, and nickel, which is critical for the urease enzyme. And so by tying up those metals, it slows both the nitrosomonas bacteria and the urease enzyme, and that's how they work. That's how those products work. Okay, that's their targeted method of function. And then there's some new products. They're called competitive cation products, newer. I'll be really candid. I don't know as much about them. I've not seen as much research and data, but we'll just keep our eye out. There's other new products coming as well, maybe even some biologicals. But those are the main ones, really, to be candid. The main ones are the nitrification inhibitors like nitropyrin and DCD, and then the urease inhibitors like NBPT and NPPT. Those are the main ones that are common, and then these other ones are also, and then the polymer coating as well. So here's where the rubber hits the road. All this stuff and all this, information. I think the thing that we should do here is just take a few minutes and just walk through some scenarios and have a conversation about, should I or shouldn't I? Which one should I use? Why should I use it? Because that's really kind of the practical aspect of what we're talking about. I throw this up here. Again, we all understand what we're trying to do is make sure that we're delivering nitrogen all the way out throughout the growing season. Okay. Now, this summer, for those of you who are out at proving grounds, I started talking about the back side of these curves. We always talk about the front side. You remember early on I showed you that data about stay green and plant health and how that's directly related to yield. One thing I want you to look about on this chart, look at the red. Okay, that is nitrogen that goes into the grain. Okay, and as you see, as the red gets bigger, you see the black gets smaller, right? If we're running out of nitrogen, you all have heard of this, right? The corn plant will take that nitrogen from stalks and leaves and move it into the grain. Well, that's okay, except that can affect and impact plant health and stay green. And I showed you those 3 different years of data from Dr. Hatfield that clearly shows if we impact plant health and stay green, we can impact yield as well. And that's why it's really important to make sure that we're providing nitrogen all throughout the growing season so that we can also minimize some of this cannibalization to the best of our ability. The other thing is to keep in mind is, V10, you take down at the bottom, you see the growth stage, you take that V10 line all the way up and then go to the right, you'll see we're still only talking about 25% of the total land up to V10. And for me, V10 is shoulder height. So we're trying to make sure we're providing nitrogen all the way through the growing season. All right, so let's hit a real life, in fact, we're going to hit on, I think, 3 different scenarios. So it's V7, V8. I'm going to put 28% on. And in this case, I'm going to use, let's just say I'm going to use a wide drop. And I'm going to dribble 28% on top. And the forecast has no rain. And I'll give you a little more information. Let's say we've got 60 pounds down in either a weed and feed, starter, or both. So the question is, if you're going to wide drop at V8 and the forecast has no rain, and this is the canopy, would you use a stabilizer? And which one would you use? All right. Now, here's my opinion. And by the way, every agronomist you talk to may have a different opinion. If I'm going to apply 28% in this canopy, remember we talked about temperature, we talked about moisture, driving, because 28% is urea, ammonium, nitrate. All right. The first thing I'm worried about is the urea portion laying on top of the soil. I want to stop that. I said the forecast has no rain. So I don't want that urea molecule to lay on top, all right, without protection where it can volatilize, especially where you see the canopy, you see the sunlight, it's probably going to be pretty warm. So it is, in my opinion, it's entirely reasonable for a grower to consider using a urease inhibitor to stop the volatilization of the urea molecule converting to gas. All right. Now, I will tell you, I've had other agronomists argue with me that the Y drop, because it's so concentrated in a band, it's almost self-stabilizing. It's not like distributing it broadcast method. But I would tell you, if a grower asks me, hey, I really feel like I want to use a urease inhibitor to stop urea hydrolysis, I would say to you, that's a reasonable conclusion. I'm not telling you it's going to pay off, right? I would tell you, all right, let's say I change this and said you're going to apply 28%, and tomorrow there's a 100% forecast for rain, and it's going to be a ½ inch of rain. The grower might say, I don't feel the need because I'm not concerned about the urea hydrolysis. I would say I agree with that. If you're sure you're going to get a rain, then you don't have to, okay? Because it'll move into the soil and you're not going to lose very much. But keep in mind, for every day that lays on top of the soil, of the urea portion, we can lose 1 to 3%. All right. Now, the second question is, should I use a nitrification inhibitor in this situation? And here again, I would tell you, this one changes a little bit. It depends a little bit on your soil type, your drainage. If I had a poorly drained, heavy clay soil and it wasn't tiled, all right, because let's step back a little bit. Once that urea gets in contact with the soil, it becomes ammonium. Then that ammonium, it's converted to nitrate, then nitrate. We're worried about losing the nitrate. We've got a long way to go in this crop. So if a grower said to me, I don't plan on coming back. I've got too many acres. I just don't have the time to come back and do another V8 or VT or V10 or V12. He said this is the only time I'm going to use my Y drop. And he asked me, should I use a nitrification inhibitor in addition to a urease inhibitor? My response would be that's not an unreasonable consideration. Okay? Some years it will pay off. Some years it may not pay off. If your soils are poorly drained, heavy clay soils, the likelihood of economic return is higher than if it's a loam with 3% organic matter and well drained and you don't have standing water. The likelihood of return is lower. But it's not unreasonable in this case to say I'm going to use both a nitrification inhibitor and a urease inhibitor. Okay? Let's do another scenario. I'll show you this before every scenario. Keep in mind, we're trying to supply that nitrogen all the way through the growing season. Okay, let's move. In this case, the grower, there's still lots of guys who will take a coulter and they will inject nitrogen into the soil. This is V4 corn, let's say. And the question is, in this case, should I use a nitrification inhibitor? And if so, which one? All right. There are two kinds of nitrification inhibitors. Urease inhibitors for the volatilization of the urea molecule and nitrification inhibitors. All right, one of the things we talked about when we said that urea hydrolysis process is if you get it in contact with soil, all right, you're going to reduce the likelihood of the volatilization because it'll combine with hydrogen, become ammonium, and be held by the soil. Because this grower is knifing it in, and by the way, I'm not saying it all gets knifed down nice and neatly into the slot. A lot of times it splashes and all that stuff. But in this case, all right, I'm trying to make considerations about what nitrification stabilizer to use. I'm sorry, shouldn't say stabilizer, not nitrification stabilizer. What stabilizer to use? I'm probably not as concerned about urea hydrolysis or volatilization because I'm moving it in contact with soil. So I'm not going to use like an agrotame or a limus in this case. But if the grower said, I want to supply nitrogen all through the year, is it reasonable for him to consider using a nitrification inhibitor? The answer is, in my opinion, yes. It's reasonable to consider that because this is very young corn. It's probably taken up 10% of the total in. We've got a long way to grow in the growing season. And therefore, it's entirely reasonable for this grower to consider using a nitrification inhibitor. And again, if, a well-drained loamy soil that doesn't have standing water, or even saturated spots, the likelihood of return could vary from year to year. That doesn't mean it's the wrong decision. It's the best decision at the time. But I would not use a urease inhibitor in this case. I would consider using a nitrification inhibitor. I think I've got two more scenarios. All right. Now here we're looking at probably V8 corn. The grower is going, let's say, in this case, in fact, let's say he uses either 28 or let's say he uses urea. All right. In this case, would you use a stabilizer, and which one would you use? Well, you see the big metal structure in the back, right? Obviously, that's a pivot. So he's got the ability to create his own rainfall. So I would use the rainfall from the pivot to water in my nitrogen, whatever form it is. I would not use a urease inhibitor because I can water it in. Now the question is, would I use a nitrification inhibitor in this case? I'm at this stage in the corn crop. Now we're looking at V8, V10. Now we're hitting that really rapid growth phase, okay? We remember the corn plant takes up the vast majority of its nitrogen in the nitrate form. So we're kind of at that balance point where we want to make sure we're providing plenty of nitrogen. We want to make sure we're providing nitrate nitrogen because that's the form that moves to the soil. Remember, ammonium form is held by the soil. It's almost positionally unavailable. The roots have to move to it pretty much. So in this case, it's kind of iffy if I'm going to use either form of a nitrification inhibitor. I'm not going to use a urease inhibitor because I can water it in. Secondly, I would say if I'm going to use a nitrification inhibitor, it would be because I have a very poorly drained soil, which typically we're not irrigating. But in this case, it's a tipping point. I would tell you the likelihood of an economic return at this growth stage is probably lower Not necessarily limited, but probably quite a bit lower for the addition of a nitrification inhibitor. So long story short, probably if it's me, I'm a tight German, I'm probably not going to spend the money on either a nitrification or a urease inhibitor in this case. I think I got one more scenario, I hope. Now we're getting late. I got a beautiful looking corn crop, right? And I decide I'm going to hit the jackpot this year. And I go out and I test, and maybe I take my soil scan, I run some soil tests, and I find out I'm a little bit tight, right? I feel like I'm gonna fly some urea on, or you got Higgy or Miller, you want to come in and wide drop, either one. Would you stabilize, and which one would you use? All right, here's my opinion. Now again, we're concerned about volatilization. We're certainly not, one thing for sure we know here, we don't want to stop the nitrification process. We want to get as much nitrogen as we can in the nitrate form to get into the corn plant. So we for sure don't want to use a nitrification inhibitor in this stage. Do we want to use a urease inhibitor to slow volatilization? Here's my opinion. Remember we talked about that urea hydrolysis process, right? It's driven by temperature, moisture, pH, things like that. If you look now, we've got a really, really tight closed canopy. There's not as much sunlight striking the surface. It's probably higher humidity. This is a real tipping point. I would say the way I would answer this question as to whether or not use a urease inhibitor at this standpoint is, my own personal opinion doesn't mean I'm right. And if you get a room full of agronomists, they'll all disagree probably. I think the likelihood of an economic return in this case is probably a little bit lower. I could be completely wrong depending on what happens. But it looks like we're in a pretty good growing season, probably in a pattern where there's been ample rainfall. So I would probably say the likelihood of an economic return from a urease inhibitor at this point is lower. So I personally, again, in this case, may not use one. Okay? I think I have one more scenario. There it is. You all have seen me show this before. I stole this picture off the internet. There is an inhibitor for this field, and it's called Remington, okay? Unless you're the sheep farmer. But in any event, that's the only inhibitor I could suggest in this case. Okay, that's really, I'm going to stop there and see if there's any questions. I'm going to summarize it and wrap it up for you. The use of stabilizers is absolutely a valuable tool for maintaining nitrogen, because we are trying to regulate the amount and level of nitrates throughout the growing season to get them into the corn plant and keep them out of the groundwater. We know that hybrids need more nitrogen later. We know that we're experiencing more heavy rainfall events, and we know that keeping that plant green and alive later into the year will drive yield. So the question you have to ask yourself is, do I need a stabilizer? And which one should I use? There are some that do both inhibit nitrification and inhibit urea hydrolysis. There are some that do either. And therefore, it's important to understand which one will pay, when to use it, and whether or not. And the thing, again, I will say, and you all have heard me say this before, right? Every decision I make as it relates to nitrogen can be 100% right or 100% wrong, depending on what happens after the decision. Sometimes you make the best decision you have at the time. Doesn't necessarily mean there's going to be an economic payoff, but it also doesn't mean the decision is wrong when you made it. You make the best decision and go with it. So, okay, there's one that popped in. How long does nitropyrin keep the nitrosomonas bacteria dead? And this is it's a great question. A couple things I will say, and Dow will use the phrase deep sleep. But here's what I would say. It will, the answer to your question kind of depends, because what happens is, this is a biological system we're dealing in. It takes a while for that bacteria to repopulate, okay? And as that bacteria repopulates, it starts that process off. I would tell you, so if you have a very cold, very wet, or very hot, very dry situation, though that is not an environment that is conducive for the repopulation of the nitrosomonas bacteria. Therefore, it can take longer. It can take 3.5 weeks um, the, for them to repopulate to a level that will start driving that process quicker. The answer to your question is they start repopulating pretty much, I mean, pretty quickly. It's 5 to 7 days, they'll start building back up, but it takes a while for them to reach critical mass to where they're really driving that process quickly. So if I want to couch this correctly, I mean, they'll start depending on the conditions, but it just depends on how quickly they repopulate before they can reach critical mass to drive that process. The bottom line is it takes, I'm going to say it gives you another at least 3 to 4 weeks before they'll build up and start driving that process. And then remember, it takes, right, another 3 to 4 weeks for that conversion process to take place. So it will slow that process down quite a bit over time. Another question, for all Y-drop applications, urease inhibitor would be the common choice, correct? Yeah, well, I mean, it is certainly reasonable. So urease, I need to slow down. For all Y-drop applications, the urease inhibitor would be the common choice, correct? That would be the common choice. It wouldn't necessarily be the only choice. Let me give you an example. There are some guys who have gotten rid of side dress bars, and they're coming in and they're doing a 2x2 or a weed and feed, and then they're coming back at like V4, V5, all right? So yes, in a V4 or V5 Y-drop application, absolutely a urease inhibitor is a good choice, in my opinion. Unless the next day there's a 100% forecast for half an inch of rain. Now that in that case, it's also reasonable to think about or consider using a nitrification inhibitor, because once that 28% gets in contact with the soil, it becomes ammonium, and then that ammonium is converted to nitrite and then to nitrate. So it's also reasonable to consider using a nitrification inhibitor. But I think the question is the first hurdle that we need to consider with Y-drop the use of urease inhibitor? The answer is yes. That's the first one we should consider for sure. If I'm going to Y-drop at let's say VT, all right, would I use a nitrification inhibitor at VT? Personally, no, I would not, because now we're in that rapid uptake phase. I want to get as much nitrogen into that plant as quickly as possible, so I would not delay that process. At VT, then you got to say, okay, would I or wouldn't I use a urease inhibitor? I would tell you it's not unreasonable if the forecast is hot and dry. I don't know, again, back to my tight German roots, I don't know that I necessarily would use one in a closed canopy, but it's not unreasonable. And yes, I think, again, the original question is, for all Y-drop applications, the urease inhibitor would be the common first choice. Yes, I think that's a fair statement. How much in can a V4 or any vegetative stage corn plant hold? Can a corn plant take up more than it needs for its growing stage? How much extra can it store for later use? Okay, that's a really good question too. Here's what I would tell you. It's interesting, and I'm gonna, for those of you who heard me talk, right? I say every day I live, I learned how dumb I was the day before, and we continue to learn. One of the things we're learning is that corn plants have, so what I'm looking for, they will select, all right, and they send triggers or stimuli to the roots to say, hey, I'm a little bit low on nitrogen today, give me some nitrogen. A little bit low on boron, give me some magnesium, et cetera, et cetera. So I'll call it selective uptake in the corn plant. So it doesn't just, it's not, I'll use a dumb bomb versus a smart bomb. The corn plant it does use selective uptake as it relates to nutrition. A V4 corn plant, in my opinion, is not going into that storage mode. Think about those graphs I showed you, right? We're getting in that active growing stage. As you move through the season, though, and we start getting that rapid uptake phase, the corn plant does use the lower stalk to store nitrates. I can't honestly tell you the number because it depends, I hate to use that phrase, but it does depend on the season and what's going on. But if you think about, how in droughts, we always say if you're going to chop the corn for silage, chop it above 18 inches. The reason for that is there are the nitrates, which are dangerous to livestock, are stored in that bottom 18 inches of that stalk. I honestly, I can't tell you what the quantity is. V4 corn plant is, in my opinion, it's more selective uptake, Once we're getting into those, past that rapid growth phase, then the corn plant is storing, it's taking up excess nitrogen and storing it down in the bottom half of the stalk. And then it will use it later on if need be. My contention is, and that's why you can go out and actually, we talk a lot about nitrate stalk testing, right? I think it's a really valuable tool at the end of the year, because you don't want to have a whole bunch of stored nitrates and you don't want to have too little. We want to maintain plant health. So it's okay for it to store some, but we don't want to starve it either. It's kind of a fine balancing point. It's not easy. But a V4 corn plant, I would tell you, I don't think it's storing a lot yet in the stalk. It's still going in that rapid growth phase. And yes, the answer is, can a corn plant take up more than what it needs for its growing stage? Yes, it tends to happen later on in that rapid uptake phase. And then again, it stores it in the lower half. I think I might have another question pop in here. What are the effects of too much nitrogen on a corn plant? Man, oh man, you guys are on it today. There are actually, I just attended a meeting on Tuesday, and we are learning, all right, that and I would tell you, I don't, maybe others understand it better than I. We are beginning to learn that there can be some unintended consequences to luxury uptake sometimes. What I would tell you, and I don't know them all, I don't understand them all, and I think pathologists and biologists, they're learning more as we go, botanists, I should say. I think you can get cell wall elongation without lignification. You can get, taller plants with stretched cell walls. There are some other consequences. Like I said, I just watched a presentation on Tuesday that was really, really fascinating. It can cause imbalances within the corn plant. So there are effects. I don't understand them all. We're still learning. And I think one of them can be, again, excessive cell wall growth without proper lignification and imbalances in the corn plant. But it's a fantastic question, and I truthfully don't have 100%. I don't have 100% answer for anything, but there can be consequences, and I think we're still learning. You know what? I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to dig into that last question a little bit, because there's some new stuff coming out, and I'm going to try to learn a little bit and try to elaborate on my non-answer in one of our future webinars, because it's a good question. There's some new information coming out. I will endeavor to discover that for you. I think we're going to call this a wrap. All right. Well, the next one we'll spend some time digging into stabilizers, the types, the forms, when to use them, how to use them, and hopefully that'll answer some more questions. So, all right. Well, thanks everybody. Appreciate it very much. Have a great day. We will be talking to you later.